Okay, so I'm here to talk about animations and animating things in React Native. So got to start a presentation with a poll, so I need to know the room I'm in. So anyone here React Native developers, put your hands up. Okay, cool, good. Android developers, so native. Okay. iOS developers, cool.
It's about a third each.
And then like non-devs as well, like maybe something else at UX and product. Okay, cool. You didn't get a bullet point on the slide. Oh, sorry, I just thought of it now. So first I want to talk about like why we want to animate things when we're building apps. As far as I can tell, my breakdown for this is there's three basic things. So there's orientation, aesthetics, and interactivity. So orientation helps the user know where they are in an app. So you'll see this as like in iOS, you see cards pushing and popping and this kind of stuff. In Android, I think you have the same thing, but it's from the bottom usually, but I don't really know. The second thing is aesthetics. So this is like purely aesthetic things to delight your users. So kind of little things to attract your attention, or something just to like grab your attention and make your app look cool. And the final thing is interactivity. So we're talking about gestures and swipes and drags and drops. And I think this last one is becoming a lot more commonplace these days. So I'm going to talk about these three things individually, and I'm going to give some examples in React Native of how you do these. So we're going to start off with orientation. So, as I said, we're talking about screen transitions, state transitions. So here we've got a screen transition, and we've got a state transition, and you kind of like, as the buttons move up and down, it lets you kind of keep oriented with where you are in the app. It lets you know how you can go back, and lets you know how you can get back to that thing again, and you can kind of build up expectations about what you can do with this app. There's another one, there's me. So that's just a simple thing. So we're going from a big image to a small image, and we just animate it, because you don't want a big snap transition from one state to another. It's disorienting for the user. You've seen enough of me now. So I'm going to do a quick demo of a thing called layout animation in React Native. This has been in React Native since, I think, like a long time ago. The React Native people, how many people have used layout animation? Okay, cool. So, okay, it's not as well known as it should be, because it's really good. So never do live coding in a presentation, but here we go. So put together a quick app which shows my three different sections. So the first one is orientation. So what I've got is a list of red balls, and we click on them and they disappear. And look at this wonderful UI. And a button to bring them all back again. So you can kind of see what's going on here. And you've got this weird thing here with these things seem to be shifting by like 1 pixel, but it's quite hard to figure out what's going on. So with React Native, because all the layout and everything is kind of handled for us, we can use this thing called layout animation. So all we have to do, if at any time you call set state, you can call layout animation configure next, and it comes with a bunch of presets. And this one is the ease in, is out preset. So now what this does is what it's doing before the state transition, it's working out all the layout position, then it runs a state transition, works out where everything's going to be, and then interpolates between the two things. So it's really simple just to create like these kind of orienting transitions. It doesn't come with many options because it's quite high level, but just with a little bit of playing around, so we can actually control which property it uses to animate creation, deletion. So there's three different things. There's creation, deletion, and updating, and it's sort of like how it transitions from something not being there to something being there. So yeah, I mean, go and look at the docs and everything for a better example, but what we can see now is my numbers are scaling out as they. So it's just some simple transitions that you can do, and I think we all agree that's kind of a bit easier to figure out what's going on. So that's layout animation. It's as simple as that before you do a state update. I've got to say this feels like cheating. It's a bit too easy. One thing I would like to know from all the iOS and Android people, does this exist in iOS and Android, or do you have to? It does. You have these kinds of things. Okay.
I can't say that's true of Android. No,
Yeah,
it's Android or iOS.
Yeah. Animate view changes. There's something on a view group that you can do.
And rubbish.
Yeah, you can.
Okay, this kind of thing exists. When I found out about this, I was like, this is
It's not a
amazing.
one-liner though, is it?
The one I'm thinking on Android is one-liner, but
Yeah.
it can be temperamental.
Yeah.
Like, as in it might not work.
Well, anyway, maybe the React Native people, something new. So next step up, talk a bit about aesthetics. So this is like how your app feels to people, so you can use animations to create tension and drama, that kind of stuff. So what I've got here is a little animation of an app where you've received an award, and instead of just telling you what it is, we can, well, bam, present it in a slightly nicer way. It can give a feeling of like luxury, just with some really simple stuff like this, just some slide-in transitions. There's a different library we use for that. It's called React Native Animatable. I'll give you a quick demo of this. It's almost as simple as the last one, but not quite. Okay. So, Rich had dogs, I've got cats. There's another cat coming later, so brace yourselves. So is a mock-up of an app we might have where we get a reward, and okay, I got a reward, but it's a bit underwhelming to just present that. So we can go and do some stuff. So we have to import, so we replace, can everyone see this? Or, okay. So hopefully this looks familiar to React and React Native developers. But essentially what we can do here is we can swap out our components from the inbuilt view components to animatable views. I've already imported animatable here, and I can. So the first thing I'm going to do is fade in the overall container. Okay, so we've got fade in, that's like slightly nicer. We'll also change animatable. We'll also change the card, and we'll have animation equals every time. Zoom in. So now that does that. I can change let's make it a bit faster. So we'll change the duration. Okay, and then the last thing we'll do is this kind of dropping in this trophy. So this time there is a strange bug in React Native that text views aren't as animatable as they should be. So we have to wrap, rather than using animatable.text, which sometimes doesn't work, we wrap it with animatable.view, and then we can say animation equals bounce in down, and then we will delay by, let's say, 1,000, and here we get that. So overall we've got that. So that's a much more rewarding scenario, right? So we're not just like popping this thing on screen. So that is basically the extent of React Native Animatable. So it looks a lot like this. So we either use animatable versions of our components, or we can wrap things. I didn't show you the Tadar one, that kind of like does a little dance in front of you. It's quite cool. Again, it's declarative. It's very high level. There's a certain amount of configuration you can do. You can describe your own transitions rather than as strings. You can describe them as like these objects of keyframes and stuff like that. But that's really good for these types of animations and transitions. This also feels like cheating. It's a bit too easy to do this stuff, but it's not all that configurable, and it can't really get involved in gestures and stuff like that. So it's kind of one-shot transitions. There is this curious little thing here which I will highlight, which is called useNativeDriver. It's not the best variable or prop name, but what this has to do with is performance. So if there's iOS and Android devs who have played with React Native, who have this understandable impression that React Native doesn't quite feel native, it's because of what I'm about to explain. So this useNativeDriver, the idea is that rather than having to run all the animations in JavaScript, you kind of like push it all over to the native side, which I will explain a bit more when we come to interactivity. So the reason this is really important for interactivity, if you're dragging something around the screen, you're swiping something or whatever, it needs to feel really, really attached to your finger. If you drop a frame, or it's running at a lower frame rate, it's not going to feel right. It's going to feel like you feel like a website or something. It's not quite going to feel native. It's quite hard to describe and it's quite hard to show in a video, but you've probably used apps where it just kind of doesn't feel native. So interactivity, we're talking things like pinch to zoom and Tinder cards and the scroll banks that you get in iOS. Good thing about these kinds of gestures, they reduce the need for putting buttons everywhere. Trades off with discoverability, so things like swiping to delete. It's not obvious that that's there. Someone has to tell you that's a thing. And then some other examples. This is from our app. You've probably seen this kind of thing, so like a parallax effect going on with the header. Come on, go back. There we go. And also this scroll nav bar was changing colour as well, and the bouncy header thing. And a similar kind of effect in there. What's really important with these kinds of things is they really have to run at 60 frames a second, otherwise it feels wrong. So the problem that we have in React Native is this thing called the bridge. So React Native runs in two parts. So you've got the native bit, this runs at 60 frames a second. It will always run at 60 frames a second unless something very extraordinary is happening. But this is where your app can feel like really smooth and everything lines up correctly. And then we've got the JavaScript bit. Between the two we've got a river. You can tell it's a river because it's got a man and a boat and a duck. I was very proud of that. I put that like 5 minutes ago. So this is the basic way that lots of event and gesture handling will work in kind of like normal React Native. So the UI emits these events. I don't know exactly what they're called in iOS and Android land, but something like this. They're going to be touch start and touch move and touch end and that kind of stuff. In order for you to deal with those in JavaScript land, it has to be serialized and sent across the bridge. Serializing is not free, and it's okay for taps and stuff, but for interactive things, you start to notice occasionally these things happen a bit too late. And yeah, you're trying to do this serialization at 60 frames a second, and it can go a bit wrong. So one example of how this can go wrong. So we've got touch start. We set some style, update the UI, touch move, set some style to update the UI, and then here, the touch move event comes across the bridge, and then JavaScript is busy doing something else. So JavaScript is famously single-threaded, so that something else could be serializing or parsing a JSON response or something like that. And you don't get any control over this, so something else is happening, and then your on-touch move handler is not called, and you miss the cross across the bridge. So here you get a drop frame. So this is the bit where you notice and you go, oh, it's jank, it feels horrible, it's not nice. This is when useNativeDriver comes in. So the idea with useNativeDriver is that you send over this config that tells your native UI how to animate, which we'll come to in a bit. I know it's a bit vague. And then all the animation happens on the native side. It never has to go across this bridge. What it means is you have to come up with a suitably descriptive declaration for what is happening in all of this bit. So before you render it, you have to tell it all the possible things it might do before it actually goes in and renders. So yeah, we have to be declarative, not imperative. So we don't get to come back into JavaScript all the time. It looks quite a lot like functional programming when you see this. I don't know enough about functional programming to explain quite why it's like functional programming, other than to me it feels like it. There's other people here who can tell you about that. And yeah, the idea is that you get the config goes across the bridge once, and you don't want to do it on every event. So, I'm going to try and do a slightly more complex demonstration. Hopefully, this is a bit harder to follow along with, but hopefully it will make some sense. So, get rid of that one. Another cat. So what we've got here, I've embedded my previous UI from another one in here. What we've got is a card that we can drag up from the bottom. You've probably seen this kind of thing in like Apple Maps and Google Maps and that kind of thing. And the way this works is, if I drag to a certain point and let go, I'll reach a certain point, a certain height, and it will animate to the top. So the way this works is I essentially have to describe all of the things that might happen with my transition. So it's very declarative. So you're saying things like, if the person releases the touch at a particular point, then run a spring animation. You have to tell it all of this ahead of time. So it looks something like this. So this is a bit messy. I'll try and explain a bit about what this is doing. So essentially we start off with this thing called Pan Gesture Handler. So this is part of React Native Gesture Handler. And from there, so the gesture event, again we're declaring that the translation Y should be of my gesture should kind of populate the drag Y variable. So I'm never actually saying like set, like per frame, set this drag Y and set this velocity Y and set this gesture state. I'm just telling it like why these things are, and we'll sort it out later basically. So here, this is where it starts to look like functional programming. So rather than like if blocks, we have conditional, what do we call them, functions that operate on conditions. And so the first argument here is a condition. Again, we're not saying such and such is equal to something. We are passing two values to an equality function. And then if this is true, so if the touch is active, then we run this stuff. And if the touch is inactive, so that's I've just let go, then we run this stuff. So there's a lot of stuff here which is to do with managing. If you've ever done like dragging and stuff, you always have to manage like the last press and the last touch and like all that kind of stuff. So there's a bit of noise in here. I'm sure we could tidy this up. But I think the important part here probably is this bit. So this is the bit that says when I let go. So this is gesture state is inactive. Set my translate Y, depending on if it's the first time I've touched it. Then I want you to run this spring animation, which is, these are all like helpers that come with React Native. What's the library called? I've forgotten. Reanimated. Thank you. So if we just want to change the behaviour, so rather than when we let go in the top portion or the bottom portion, I want to say if we kind of like if we're flicking it. So here I can do, if the drag velocity Y is greater than 0, then go to the bottom, otherwise go to the top. I need to come out of this when I'm back in. So now I can let go of it in the bottom half, but as long as I'm moving upwards when I let go, it's going to flick to the top, and then I can flick it to the bottom. So I've only had to change like one bit here. I haven't had to do a load of like if the such and such when I let go of this thing, then do that. It's nice and declarative. We can also incorporate some other things here. So I'm just going to do something for the scale. So what I want to do here is I want to change the scale of this thing. So I want to shrink this card down as it goes to the bottom and scale it back up when it goes to the top. So we'll take the offset Y and we're going to interpolate it, and it's going to have an input range, let's say 450 to 600, and an output range of 1 to 0.9. So what this is saying, when the Y position is 450, I want the scale to be 1, and then between 450 and 600 I want it to scale down to 0.9, and then what I have to also do is tell it exactly what to do when things are outside of that range. So if my Y position is 300, let's say, I don't want you to like scale it up beyond 1, I want it to stop. So if we run this one, you can see he's a little bit shrunk now, and then there you go. And I can still fling it up and down. And you see it, not only is it doing it when I'm doing the gesture here, but also as it flings down it still runs that animation at the end. And that's to do with these clock constructs. I won't really get into it because I kind of don't really understand it in all that much detail. But also it's quite the spring function, the run spring function is this. But you can just copy this from the documentation. They've got loads of examples of how to do this kind of stuff. But you can see like how it's declarative and kind of wiring things up and saying when this value is here, then be there. When it's there, be there. I'm not having to manipulate and orchestrate these animations, which is quite nice, and it's super performant, so it doesn't have to cross the bridge all the time. So that's that. So it's gesture handler reanimated. This is a bit messy. This doesn't feel like cheating because it's quite tricky. Feels like you're actually doing some work. So yeah, it's a bit weird. You've got these like animated value containers, and you've got set and cond and stuff. It's not what you're used to writing for animations, I think generally. But it is super performant. It's nice and declarative, and it's really composable, which is a really nice feature. So anytime you've got a value, you can replace that value with like a conditional, or replace it with a multiplication, or something like that. I think that's just like a feature of its kind of functional roots. So if you go back to why we animate things, so orientation, you can use layout animation. For aesthetics, you can use React Native Animatable. And for interactivity, you can use gesture handler and reanimated together, and then make sure everything's nice and performant and feels like a proper native app. Reanimated seems to be taking over the world a bit. They've got a new thing which does the layout transition, layout animation stuff. So the orientation stuff you can now do in React Native Reanimated. Everything that's in React Native Animatable can be implemented in terms of React Native Reanimated. And yes, I think it's kind of like going to take over a bit. It's a really nice library. It's really well put together. So yeah, finally, when I talked about orientation, aesthetics, and interactivity, jump away from like coding and stuff now. I talked about them as though they were kind of like these separate things, but they're not. And we've got a Venn diagram that shows this. So,
the app sweet spot.
And where is the best bit of a Venn diagram? It's in the middle. There it is. So there's certain types of animations that they occupy this middle bit. So think of the inertial scrolling, and think of the pull to the bounce and pull to refresh, and these kinds of things. They occupy this bit in the middle, and they're the ones that they're not like superfluous, and they're not just kind of like there for the sake of it. They occupy this place where they really provide some aesthetic value, they really provide some interactivity and functionality, and they help people know what's going on within the app. So if you're doing animations, try and be in that bit and don't try and be all the way over here. because this is the kind of wishy-washy bit that no one really cares about. So that's it. I'm Tom. I work here. Yeah.